So thank you for these kind words and this kind introduction. Can you all hear me also in the back? Yes? Very good. Thank you for being here despite the beautiful weather. So I'm going to show you 4 projects, and I'm going to talk about these 4 projects, but I'm first going to do a long introduction. I always do this because I think it's important to tell a bit what we like and what we find important, and to share this with you. I've written a text in the Swiss magazine Archithese, and I don't think you've all read it. Would surprise me. But I'm going to use a brief compact version of this because I think it's important to use this. The introduction, by the way, consists of 4 parts. Now, this is part 1. In 1982, there was a legendary debate between Peter Eisenman and Christopher Alexander at the Harvard University in the United States. And both of them presented different standpoints, but both of them also understood architecture as a form of language. And I would say, for us in our practice, their lively discussion is relevant. And I'm going to take a quote, a part of their debate, because I think it's very funny, and also because it draws out, or it outlines the current dilemma in our practice. So, the topic of the debate led to the extremely slender columns of a design by Rafael Moneo, the Logroño City Hall. It was designed by Rafael Moneo in 1974, and Christopher Alexander said to Peter Eisenman, this is a quote, "The thing that strikes me about your friend's building, if I understood you correctly, is that somehow, in some intentional way, it is not harmonious. That is, Moneo intentionally wants to produce an effect of disharmony, maybe even of incongruity." And Peter Eisenman replied, "That's correct." And Alexander went on, "I find that incomprehensible. I find it irresponsible. I find it nutty. I feel sorry for the man. I also feel incredibly angry because he is fucking up the world." And I think this is a beautiful quote, not because of the swearing, but I feel that in our practice we feel affinity with both positions, and we choose to operate within this dilemma. Now, during this talk, I will now and then use the word we, because as Professor Riegler already introduced, I am not alone. Monadnock consists of 2 partners, Sander Naus and me. And we were both trained on an Academy of Fine Arts as furniture, interior, and stage designers before we continued our studies in architecture. And we've both gained our first practice environment working in an office in Antwerp in Flanders. We were both very much attracted by the craftsmanship of the Flanders scene at that time because it was something that was not to be found in the Netherlands. And this makes us, probably more focused on this background makes us probably more focused on the visual impact and the image of architecture than primarily being occupied by the techniques, because we always think they come later or come after. Now, after our surrealistic Flemish experience, we've both returned to the Netherlands, and my colleague Sander became a collaborator at MVRDV, and an office which is among the glorious offspring of OMA. And I became a collaborator at Rap & Rap, the office of Christian Rapp, a talented pupil of Hans Koolhof. This means two complete opposite perspectives, you could say, on architecture, on thinking about architecture. And I think we've both been spending about 4 to 6 years of our lives there, day and night, and we were heavily influenced by these environments and are implicitly also and also explicitly combining these experiences into the language of our office. And I think it's also necessary to tell this. I think it's good to show your influences because it helps understanding our architectural vocabulary as being embedded in a wider understanding or a longer line in history. And of course there's common ground between these two worlds. And I think this also reveals a bit of a dilemma, a productive dilemma. And we try to find a balance between these two worlds. Now, then I'm going to show you, that's part 3, a cover of an important book for us. And it's important because we think architecture should definitely be able to be part of contemporary visual culture. Yet simultaneously, architecture should also be able to resist this, you could say, one-day fly dimension that we find in blogs, Instagram, magazines, and other image dumping media. Because the problem with this that it appears to flatten out knowledge, love, and efforts that builders and architects are doing in the making of a building. And for me, it's clear that architecture should not do attempts to keep in pace with the speed of these everyday digital environments. And I'm actually convinced that the design of a layered and ambiguous building is a strategy of resistance, or of survival even. So by simultaneously offering a certain amount of instant gratification, yet avoid the possibility of a singular reading. And I would say the seeking for complexity and even contradiction, this would be a way to make an intriguing building and to open it up for more discoveries on several scale levels. And this sometimes brings us in the league of postmodernism. And honestly, we have no fear for this exotic era in architecture. We enjoy the irony, the playfulness, the eclecticism, and of course the historic references. And honestly, we simultaneously always get a bit disappointed by this period of giants when it comes to detailing or a denial of the materiality. So that's something we try to avoid. For us, it's not necessary to produce buildings that are very abstract in order to clarify a concept. And we also engage with the economy of means. Now, last part of the introduction. Why our name Monadnock? And as a habit in giving a lecture, I always feel the urge to tell something about this name of our office. Just to make sure you spell it right. And it's actually the introduction to a building in Chicago, as you can see on the right side, which is named the Monadnock building. We fell in love with this building, and I will tell you why. Because it's of an astonishing beauty. And when we started to study it, we became more and more intrigued by it. We also found out that it refers to a type of mountain, which you can find all over the world, a so-called Monadnock, which is a mountain that actually is appearing in a process of erosion where the soft grounds get spoiled away and the hard rock remains there with a beautiful silhouette. And that's therefore also a very accurate name for the building in Chicago. It almost requires a lecture in itself to talk about this building. But not only we fell in love with it, we were also intrigued by the fact that it's one building and contains two parts, these two parts were designed by two couples of architects, Burnham and Root and Holabird and Roche. Burnham and Root, they took approximately 10 years from sketch design to the realization of their part. And then Holabird and Roche took, I think, only 4 years for that. And the whole building was finished in 1892. And the funny thing is that when we talk about this building with people, clients, friends, other architects, they always assume that the newer part is the right part and the older part is the left part, while it's the opposite. And that's an intriguing thing, our connotation or understanding about the age of things and what the role of decoration is. So this part by Holabird and Roche is a complete steel structure and was the material of the future at that time and speeded up the realization time tremendously, while this more abstract building part by Burnham and Root is one of the tallest brick structures in the world. It's about 17 layers, and it's load-bearing brick combined with some steel reinforcements, but the main material is brick. And the whole idea of decoration is completely different, because this part, the more massive part, is designed as a monolith, and the beauty about it is that all the decorations, they come from the volume, or if you like, the sculpture of the volume itself. So there's not a strict division between plinth, middle, and top. No, there's a big belly bulking out, which actually makes the plinth, resulting in reliefs or almost 75 centimeters. And then the bay windows, they have beautiful, or oriels, they have beautiful rounded bricks that actually add up to the plasticity of the building. You get the feeling that the bay windows actually bulb up out of the surface of the facade. And this is the last image I'm going to show of this building. The corner, the edge of the building, starts very sharp and then goes up all the 17 floors and ends up in a rounded cornice, but that already starts here. Very refined and beautiful. In a rather abstract way, you could say simultaneously it celebrates the possibilities of the material of brick. Now, as I said before, I'm tempted to give a complete lecture about this, but I'm not going to do that. I'm also going to talk about our own projects. And this is a quote by one of the architects of the right part of the Monadnock building, Daniel Burnham, and he used this quote, "Make no little plans." And it's a very helpful quote, because for us it stands for the ambition and perspective on architecture. So in our practice we design buildings, small buildings, we design furniture, objects, drawings, interior, publications, we teach, we write, and all these things we like to treat in an equal way, or at least in something that is related to each other. They derive from the same set of ideas, and I would say in this process of dealing with these things, we deliberately switch scales and ignore the complexities that come along with that. We think that all these things can and should be carriers of architectural ideas. So I've been an editor of the OASE Journal for Architecture, where I've been involved in a couple of publications on topics such as clients, models, Baroque, continuity in architecture. And we've also used the quote of Burnham for a large installation on a public square in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, which is a central city. It was there for 10 days, and that's beautiful because it allows you to be very brutal, because after 10 days it's gone. Well, we were used in the practices that we were working before starting our office to deal with buildings and build structures in a very serious and thorough way. So making a building took us, even when it was small, it took 2 or 3 years at least. And these kinds of structures, they require, I would say, a preparation time of 2 months, and then it's there for 10 days. And that's a complete different approach. And we found out that that it's a very helpful open-air laboratory to test things and to see how public behaves, because this is a festival and it's open for everyone coming by. So we started to feel more engaged with also, let's say, shorter snacks, as you wish. And we also, I would say, increasingly found them more valid and valuable to deal with as a test ground. We also contribute to this small booklet by Marius Grootveld, Building Upon Building, where we know that we will never build this, but we deliver a drawing for a proposal of a tower complex, which will be next to the Dutch Parliament in The Hague. At least that's our proposal. And these drawings, they also are helpful to formulate themes for facades or thoughts about decoration and how to relate to the existing neo-Renaissance complex of the Dutch Houses of Parliament. We also make a vedute, where we make a combination of our own buildings with buildings of colleagues and people we admire, and bring them together in a collage. And the act of drawing is something we take very serious and also see as something which is something to engage with and as a field of testing. When we were invited to take part in this exhibition in the Deutsches Architekturmuseum in Frankfurt, we did a proposal for a small set of objects, and we had no clue what they meant, and gave them a title, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And you could say the making of these plaster objects, we imagined them to be buildings and simultaneously be objects. I would say the biggest object is about this high, so they're really small. And only later, you could say, post-rationalizing, we try to give meaning to them sometimes, which is also valid. So we then use the things we found for an exhibition design we were invited for in the New Institute in Rotterdam. And then we use the things we discovered to make bigger pavilions in an exhibition, which was about the surface of things. But now, for us, this all is part of the make no little plans, but give meaning to the even small things you do. And we try to avoid to make everything heavy. We try to see this as one big field for playing and testing and trying out. Now, this is the one of the oldest projects we did, the pavilion on the River Maas in Rotterdam. And I always like to tell a bit about it because it's such a funny project. It is a temporary structure in the city center of Rotterdam. As you can see, here is the bridge. Before there was the Rotterdam, which is now here. This is the building by Renzo Piano. So quite a central spot, and it was a small competition. We were invited to take part to make a pavilion for the city beach. Now, let me explain a bit about the city beach. You will find this in every city, like in Berlin and in Paris and in other cities in Europe as well, where the city dwellers are offered a small beach to avoid traveling to the real beach. It's a very popular destination in Rotterdam. The question for the competition was to make a very clear symbol that would announce the beach, but also would logistically make it a controlled environment. Now, you have to imagine that on the level of this controlled environment, something strange happens because there is a thin layer of sand and everybody starts to behave differently in their beach clothing in the middle of the city, which is rather unusual. But I would say the condition of this fence and the thin layer of sand evokes this, and that's quite beautiful, I think. And our beach pavilion is something that did not really engage with the sand, I would say. It tried to make two faces, one to the beach itself and one to the city. We had large discussions with our clients to keep the announcement, the billboard, clean and not to write Coca-Cola on there, but to announce strand, which is in Dutch beach, and treat it as an ironic billboard for what was happening behind it. As you can see, we managed to keep it clean. There's only a small sign here. It's a combination of several typologies. It's a billboard combined with a small cabin. It's a wooden building with a steel structure, cladded with wood. We combined the typologies of a so-called gatehouse with the idea of signage, publicity. We were completely intrigued by these beautiful pictures by Bernice Abbott that made these pictures in New York several decades ago, where you can see the signage sometimes completely taking over the building. So you sometimes even have the idea that there's also a building behind the signage. Now we tried to engage with that idea that the signage would take over, because we thought that it would be important to be brutal and bold and visible in the cityscape. In the middle of this billboard, there's a hole. When you are welcome, the gate is open, and when you're not, the gate is closed. Behind the gate, there's a hole in the roof, so the light shines in, which makes it more attractive to enter. This is where you enter, and you can go right or left, and then you walk through the bar to the veranda or the porch, and then you have a beautiful view over the river. As I mentioned before, it's like a Janus head, the building. So big to the city and small and intimate to the beach, where it has detailings, where it has materiality, doesn't need to be abstract and big anymore. Complete different character. The character also refers to, I would say, American rural typologies. I will tell a bit about that later. First, I show you the plans. In the ground level, there are containers, there's a kitchen, and on the first level where you enter, there are the toilets and there is a bar. This is the section. So if you choose to go straight ahead, you will go down the stairs and immediately end up in the sand with your feet. Yeah, we were, for this character on the beach, we were looking at these nice rural typologies that you find in the outside of the cities in the United States. Typologies like a planter's house where you have a veranda all the way going around, or a dog trot house, which is a very strange typology where the house gets split into two and has a gate all the way through. There are several stories about why it evolved like this, but one is that the wind blows through and there's a natural cooling. And the other story is that the sheep were not daring to cross this house, so they would always stay within the fence here, but I'm not so sure. As you can see in this axonometric, we try to clearly combine these elements and bring them to one singular form again. It was quite a popular spot. It was there for 2 times, and the deal was that the pavilion would be there for 3 years. It's non-insulated, so it's only there for summers. But then it became a tiny bit too popular because there were parties organized, and in one of the parties there were the Rotterdam hooligans, and they made quite a riot with the police, and then the mayor of the city decided to stop this beach here. So no pavilion anymore. So the pavilion got sold, and I think it's now somewhere in a recreation camping park in the south of the Netherlands. And we don't dare to look at it anymore because we kind of lost track, also on purpose, because at a certain moment you also have to let go your babies. Although we love this one very much, it was also our first lawsuit that we tried to be in control as architects about what happened with the pavilion. But in the end, I think it's a bit connected to temporary buildings that at a certain moment you have to let go. Now, this is the cityscape, and then you can see how it performs. Second project has 2 acts. First act is a small renovation, you could say, of an industrial building. The Royal Tigelaar is the oldest family company in the Netherlands. And its main production is ceramic tiles, painted ceramic tiles, handcraft painted tiles, but also for the building industry, the tiles on the roofs, the red ones. Now, this was the existing complex, and the client was doing a lot of business with architects, but needed a renovation of this complex, and was a bit shocked that he did not invite an architect while he was already talking with a contractor to do a renovation and an extension. So he called us and asked whether within the bandwidth of the limited amount of time we would like to think about what we could do with this family of production facilities. And we were, of course, bound to the existing grid. We looked at what a factory hall actually is and what is, you could say, significant or characteristic. And we thought the shed lights would be a beautiful motif to use. The gray area is the existing, the white is the extension, and it's a division into 3 halls, you could say, or 3 houses that are family. Some are higher, some are lower, and they're family because of their basic form, groenvorm, you could say, with their sheds. And of course, also the color brings them together, and the plinth binds them together. Now you have to imagine that this is quite a dirty environment, a production facility with ovens in there, heat, very warm, and the area around is where all the ground and the clay was parked, and then would be brought in by a shuffle inside. The clay itself is brownish, so we thought it would be very wise to make the plinth of the building also brownish. And then when it comes out of the oven, it's red, so we also thought, or orange red, that it would be wise to use that color for the aluminium plating of the top of the building. And although we had several discussions with the client to use his beautiful material for his own factory, he was afraid that it would not be able to resist the tough environment of this utilitarian building, where the shovel would hit the plinth and demolish the beautiful tiles. Now, it's a very simple building, and the inside is, as you can see, loud and dirty and light also. And there's one place in the building where you can see where you could say the human skill, or the people are really invited, and that is the room where all the samples are exhibited, you could say, or it's a storage room where all the different pigments and types of glazing are being exposed. So you can imagine that our architects visiting this are going completely mad here because of all the beautiful possibilities. And here are some views about the canteen. Now, so we designed this factory building, and in the small center of the small village, which is an historic village called Makkum, there were the offices and also the showroom. And then the client decided to get rid of this complex, to sell it, and to move the whole company into the production facility. While we had been making, you could say, a rather harsh and utilitarian environment, all of a sudden the whole perspective switched because it needed to be representative as well. People had to be welcomed there. So that was a new question for us, because the beautiful and nostalgic appearance of this would completely disappear. And we had to turn this harsh environment into something which was also nice to be, because also the offices would be working here. So our idea was to make use of a strategy that we were intrigued by already for quite a while, and that is a drapery room or a tent room by Schinkel. It's nearby, at least when you're from Rotterdam, it's nearby. And it's in Potsdam. And here, another image of that. So Schinkel is using camouflage here, you could say, to cover the complete room by textile. And that's a beautiful strategy that we almost literally followed, because we thought this is the ultimate way to create a soft environment within this harsh factory. So we did. We proposed to make a grand stair that would invite you very clearly to go up to the first floor. And then we divided the working space into several rooms. And the division would always be out of glass, so that there would always be a contact between the workers and also between the people having meetings. And it would always be possible when you would be working here to have contact with the production area here. And all these rooms, they got their own ceiling, textile ceiling, their own shape that anticipated to the section of the existing building. So as you can see here, it's a very simple tent structure, which is mainly used for the ceiling. And that covered the aluminium cladding of the roof and turned it into a complete illusionary environment, you could say. Here, layout again. So this is the big stairs. Big stairs are hanging on the facade, but also standing on the ground on two very tiny corners, inviting you to go up, a model. And this is the result. And you can see that everything is actually covered behind this ceiling. And the nice thing is that the light still comes in, but in a very diffuse way. And it's also being transported by the textile deeper into the working spaces. And the textile that we used is an industrial textile, which allows you to ventilate right through. And you can peel it off and then wash it once in half a year and then put it up again. And then it's back in its own shape. Also, that makes it possible to put all the ventilation stuff on top of the ceiling and just as the artificial light. So that makes it quite a tranquil environment. Now, we were also invited to design the cabinets. We covered the cabinets with felt, and of course the floor is covered with also with carpet. The only thing we did not manage was to cover also the walls with the same textile. That was one bridge too far for the client, but the rest is all, I would say, rather soft. So the window frames are out of the wood, the same wood as we used for the tables and the cabinets. And the tables and the cabinets are a family. The grid of the cabinets is in the same line of the grid of the tables. So they are in the same rhythm. And we also thought that it would be nice to lift up the cabinets and put them on high heels. Because that's something we learned from Joseph Frank. Joseph Frank, the Austrian Swedish architect, that learned us that it's important to put a cabinet on high heels instead of putting it right on the floor, because on the floor it's too heavy and too dominant. Well, when you put it on high heels, it actually becomes more elegant and more spacious. I think the cabinets of Joseph Frank are really, really much more elegant. This was our first attempt, and I hope more will follow. And this is the third project, and after this one I'm going to show one more. That's the Atlas House. But this is the landmark Nieuw Bergen, is something that led to quite a lot of discussion and or polemics even within the Netherlands, but I also understood outside of the Netherlands, and we really like that it divides the world into people that completely hate this building and people that fall in love with it. And we're we're fine, actually. It's nice to make a building that evokes emotions, so to say. Now, it's this project, and I'm going to show you first where it's located. It's located in a very small village called Nieuw Bergen. Nieuw Bergen in the southeast of the Netherlands, close to the German border, close to Düsseldorf. It's a province of Limburg, and here we zoom in. You can see the river there, the river Maas, and it's going all the way to the sea. And you have a beautiful natural park here, and between the national park and the river there's the provincial road, and on one side of the provincial road there, close to the river, there's the old historical authentic village called Bergen, and along the provincial road there's the new extension of Bergen, and that is called New Bergen, which is I would say a new town from the 60s. We're all talking about small villages here, but the thing about this new town is that it has to deal with the dominance of the cars. So instead of having a very authentic, cozy market square, the market square is actually a parking place. And along this thinking of such a, I would say, dominance of the car, it would make complete sense, of course, to do a layout like this. But it's also very sad and depressing. Now, it's of course snowy here, but we felt immediately that something had to be done here, and we were invited for a competition to think of a landmark. And that was actually all that there was offered in the brief, make a landmark. And why? Because this small village, New Bergen, wanted to be a player on the horizon, because all the old authentic villages in the area had their own church tower and therefore were visible from far away as a point of orientation. And New Bergen could not play along with the boys, you could say, so they wanted to have a viewpoint as well. Now, this was part of a complete restructuring of the village, because there was a project developer that had thought that this parking place should be filled in with a new housing complex along with shops, and then this is the town hall, and then this would be the place where we would land our landmark. This is the national park, which attracts a lot of German tourists, and that they first go to New Bergen and then go into the park. So it is a destination. And when we had to think about what this landmark could be, we started to make a collection, and that's something we very often do. We just start to make a collection of typologies, vertical typologies, also typologies we find in the environment, because it's an old coal mine area, so you find these kinds of structures, but also water towers, and they're all, I would say, significant silhouettes, but also some of them are behaving like one shape out of one form, one monolithical thing, and sometimes they're really like an assemblage or collage of things stacked on top of each other. Then we start testing, make dozens of models, and in the end we won the competition with this proposal, and that's, I would say, a small house with a large chimney on top, and the chimney allows you to walk all the way to the top, and in the chimney there's a carillon glockenspiel that we recycled because it was standing on the parking place. And the alderman of the municipality was happy, and the project developer was happy. And we were kind of happy that we won the competition. But the urbanist involved was not happy. So he was part of the jury and allowed us to win, so to say, but immediately said that this was really not a tower he had imagined, because a tower was something that was like massive and like an extrusion form, substantial, a real big amount of mass. And So the project developer gave us a phone call and told us we have a problem, and if you don't solve the problem, then you lose the commission, because you need to be clever now and make me happy, but also the urbanist happy, because I am not going to make a very substantial tower here, because all the people in this village, they live in small houses with a garden, and I'm not going to sell any apartment here, so don't even try. Now, the nice thing of such a development is that it forces you to reformulate what you are actually doing. So we changed our design, and actually we also changed the whole approach, because it forced us to formulate what kind of building it should actually be. It was a non-religious, important building with, I would say, a civic understanding of it should be able to play a role in the collectivity of the structure of this village. And we started thinking of what kind of things we found on market squares in older historical towns in the Netherlands. And of course a town hall, a church, but also a trade building. I think it's also in Germany and in Flanders. These trade buildings are very specific, strange, typical buildings with strange proportions, richly clad, at least to Dutch standards, with natural stone, so not brick, a lot of decorations, and most of the time they're standalones, and they have a very typical division. So the ground level is very high and very open, so the trade would take place there, the waging, I think the German word is wagen, would take place here, and then the administration would be upstairs, a more quiet floor. And well, we thought if we want to refer to a certain type of building, then this would be helpful. Also because it is small and it actually wants to be big, but actually isn't. Now that was a very useful strategy. So we came to a second proposal where we tried to make the base of the building not a small house with a pitched roof, but a more proud and vertical house. And on top of that, we stacked two towers, and from some of the angles, the towers would melt together into something which contained more mass, and sometimes it would, from diagonal views, it would open up. This is the scheme where you can see the two towers and why two towers. Now, one tower has the function to be visible from far away. That's the big one, and the small one is a tower for access. So that's what we learned from old fortresses. It's completely normal there that you have a small tower on top of the tower, and or a small house, I would say, on top of the tower, which contains the staircase and is, in our case, also insulated. While the high tower is not insulated. In a way, you could say it's a folly or even a billboard, because it only wants to signal that the village of New Bergen is there. And in the plinth, we thought that we would make a bar. Oh yeah. Why do I show this? I show this because it's a beautiful example of stacking. So if you cover your hand on top of the brick, or let's say the stone part, you think that the plinth has the ambition to grow out to be a skyscraper. But what landed on top of this ambitious plinth? A small wooden house. I think that's really beautiful, this collision of two strange things on top of each other, and with two languages, and also something which is, I would say, very sustainable, while the wooden top is very, I would say, not necessarily unsustainable, but much more flimsy, less monumental, and that's a beautiful combination, I think. So, and I'm sure that Sullivan never had the intention to build this on top. I think it's also partially a reconstruction of what was there before. But these kinds of examples are very helpful when we think about things like stacking. Also it learned us that the contrast was perhaps a tiny bit too much. This is the building as it is right now. This is not a rendering. This is a picture. And now you can see that we made the things on top family of the base of the building. But by changing the patterns, it still shows individuality. For us, it was completely clear that this building was not allowed to have a backside. It needed to perform to all sides. It needed to be inviting also to all sides, because on one corner it was communicating, you could say, with the town hall, and on the other side there was a complex of new houses. And on this side, it's the market square. We have more pictures. So it was visible from all sides. Yet, we did have to, of course, make some utilitarian parts that would actually evolve into something like a backside, or at least close some of the parts of the facade. But the first thing we did was to make a grid that would bind everything together. That's a grid that goes all around and makes actually the first order in the facades, and also determines the scale, the verticality. And then behind this first layer of the grid, we placed the windows. And the windows, they change per side. So that makes that a building has different faces, if you like, to the different sides. So on the market square it's more open, and on the other sides it's a tiny bit more closed. So by binding the windows together into one window and separating them on other sides, there's also something happening with the scale. Sometimes we close the arch, and sometimes we open it, and therefore it's more open and visual what is happening inside. We also wanted this to be a very joyful and happy building. Yeah, I will show you later how that works. But this is the plan, and one fourth of the plan is containing the staircase and some technical stuff and storage rooms, and the rest is actually empty. So we thought that it would be possible to make a bar here or here, and it's a small intimate environment, but it has a high ceiling. So you enter here or here or here, and then you ask the bartender whether you could go up. So there's always somebody in control. Then you would go here all the way up. There's a floor in between. That's, you could say, room for celebrations or meetings. And there's an in-between room for the toilets. You would end up here on the first balcony. On the balcony you would be able to look over the market square, so you're relatively close to the ground. And then you would enter the second tower, and through the spiral staircase you would walk up, all the way up, and you would have a beautiful view over the landscape. For us it was also an experiment, because at least I was taught that you should celebrate the beauty of the pure material brick. Here we did something which was completely not allowed. We started to paint the brick. You could say that we always explain this as a red building. which we painted partially green. So during the production process, the red brick is being covered on two sides, one stretcher and one head of the brick with cement or slurry, greenish slurry. And that allowed us to all of a sudden have two colors and to start painting and to start using patterns and to not only give significance to the building from the plasticity of the facade, the depth of the grid, and also not of the beams that are there and the arches, but also the layer of patterning became activated. We did research on local patterns, and actually we used a lot of patterns that were to be found there in the brickwork, the local brickwork. This one not. That's a Brazilian bond. That's for the high tower where we made holes in the brickwork to let the wind go through, which is good for construction. And we started to pattern the building. There's a certain switch. So on one side we used a pattern where we gave priority to the red diagonals, and on the other side we gave priority to the green diagonals. So although the building looks perhaps very absolute in its continuity of grid and the use of bricks, there are a lot of subtle changes in there and switches with the same ingredients. And this is how it's performing nowadays. Now, not completely, because it was closed off for a long time. Because it was very hard to find somebody that wanted to make a bar there. And that's a bit ironic in a way, because it means that for a long time it wasn't actually really a folly, because it was standing there and had it of course had an urban impact because it structured the entrance of the village, and it was you could say, orientation point for the market, and of course it performed on the horizon, but it did not really play a role in the collective environment of this small village. Now recently the bar was opened, luckily, so now you can enter it, and we hope that people start engaging with it more, because when it was just opened, although we had used all kinds of patterns from the regional brick traditions, people thought that there would be a mosque in their small village. And we were heavily surprised by that, naive architects, because we thought that we would make something that would fit there perfectly. But for them it was an alien, and even something that was so strange that they, well, not completely protested it, but were very, very cautious with it. And then more and more architecture tourists came, and they started to love it a bit more. That really helped. And I think it now found a good place, and eventually they will, I think, embrace it more and more, especially now it's really opened. So everybody could already walk up the tower, and the tower would be closed off in the evening, but it did not contain a bar yet. Here you can see the brickwork, and here you can see, I hope at least that you can see it here, that the bond switches over the corner. And this is the view on the top, where you can actually see here the towers of the neighboring villages. And like I said before, this is actually nothing more than a folly. And we really enjoyed also the idea of that the building wants to be a sturdy, massive block, and simultaneously the tower is not at all. It has a representative side and an unrepresentative side. In the interior, the bricklayers gave us a phone call and asked us whether they should finish the inside in a smooth way, and we said no, leave the beards, the cement, which was popping out, leave it there. We like the idea that we have a rough side and a smooth side, so to say. And this is an axonometric. Well, for us it was also quite a test to see how to deal with verticals, pillars, and how they would meet the horizontal beams in brickwork, especially how to go around the corner with such a thing as a column, a brickwork column, and then a lintel that needed to, or a beam that needed to continue. How to do that in the brickwork detailing. And also we did a lot of tests with the depth of the grid, because at a certain point when the grid gets too deep, it doesn't act anymore as something which is melted together to the wall of the, to the back wall, you could say. And what we liked so much was that it was ambiguous, that it was something that melted together as one system or one surface, and that the beams would actually, and the grid would actually bulb out. Completely ignoring also the arches, overruling the arches, and also overruling the windows. And our solution was, oh yeah, this was actually what I should have told when I was talking about the cabinet. This is the example of Joseph Frank. Look at the elegant high heels here, you can see. This is, we go back to the landmark now. This is a test we do, plaster models. And this is an example of Giovanni Muzio in Milano. And he had to deal with the same problem. So how to actually pull the beams around the corner while it would meet the vertical pillar. Now, the crucial detail is of course covered by the leaves here. But we learned that he actually ended with a special square brick, which we did not completely trust, because we were afraid that it would pop out after the first freezing. So what we did here was giving a slight priority to the vertical and let the beam stick in. Now, that's very nerdy, of course, to talk about these kinds of things. But it also is very nice, because that's what we like. We like to have a complex strategy, you could say, about the performance of the building. But we always fully engage also with the detailing and the way it should be built, because the making is absolutely part of the thinking. So this is how you can find it these days. And what's a last thing about the building before I move on to the last project is, for us it was completely clear that we did not want to be part of this world, and we did not want to be part of this world because this is very depressing and shallow, and this is too nostalgic. So we tried to find a position that was not completely ignoring the rest, so to say, but would be a standalone, perhaps just like the buildings I showed in the beginning, the trade buildings. Later, we found out that on the in the municipality Bergen, the authentic historical village, there was a graveyard, and on the graveyard there was this beautiful ruin of a tower. And we only found out afterwards, but it contained a beautiful stacking of different layers, almost palimpsest way of dealing with different stone types and brick types from the area. And it's a ruin, and now we can only hope that this landmark will not disappear at a certain moment like the beach pavilion, but will evolve into a beautiful ruin. I will go now to the last project. That's the Atlas House, and the Atlas House is a building, a private house in the south east of the Netherlands, in the city called Eindhoven, and Eindhoven is the city where the electricity company Philips originates from. So the family of Philips had his residence there in this beautiful country estate for many years. And in the Netherlands we have this typical tradition to make a lot of terraced or row housing. And then sometimes, when the rationality of the row housing does not completely fit anymore, we have a leftover piece of land, and there we say, this is where you can buy your freedom. You can make your own villa here. But of course, in this small piece of land with villas, there are very tiny patches, and the villas are being built very close to each other, unfortunately. But it's a bit of a free zone, you could say. Although there was still some control by architects that everything needed to be white-ish. But our clients, a couple, obtained this small piece of land, and the beauty is that it looks over the country estate, and with beautiful old trees. It's really like a forest. So although you would have all kinds of neighbors around you after a couple of years, you would also always have a beautiful forest in front of you. So a small piece of land, a small budget, and the wish for a garden, and the wish for a very big house. So we were completely challenged by that question, and we proposed to go for two models. And one model would be a so-called bungalow to fill the complete plot with a one-layered house, and then make a big patio in the middle, and in the patio there would be plants and trees, and you would live around your garden, which was in the center of your house. And the other option was the opposite, that we said, we're going to try to make a very compact footprint, and then we organize the house in a vertical way, like a small tower, and then you have a barrier or a garden surrounding your house for reasons of privacy as well. They chose the latter, and so we call this a tower. It's of course not a tower, but it's a vertical organized house with a very compact footprint. We make images like this, not to prove that we have a linear design process, not at all. But it helps us to make these kinds of images to sharpen our thoughts about how it could appear, how it could perform, what the expression of the building should be. And it's a way of testing, actually. So it's, besides making models, we also make these kinds of drawings. And for us it was clear that we wanted to use brick because we thought we could use one type of brick for the interior and the exterior of the building, and then be relatively cheap by using this one brick. It was a red brick, and of course we then decided to paint parts of the building to come closer to the request of making a white-ish environment, and so all the villas would be white. And then we started to make window patterns that perform per side, and sometimes also ignore the other side. So it's a very frontal development of the facade, almost graphical development, like almost 4 cards are being put together. Each of the cards containing its individual face, so to say. And the windows do not reveal anything of the interior. They have their own logic, and the things that binds them together is the idea of a plinth, and the plinth is by revealing the bare brick, and the top is by covering the brick with whitish cement to give it a kind of lightness. We also pulled up the corners to even enforce the idea of lightness, to make it almost appear like something of a textile coverage. But I was talking about the facade, and I will come back to that a bit later when I show the sections, because actually the surprise is more in the section of the building. Because if you look at the plans, then it's rather simple. It's a collection of rooms, always the same on 3 floors, always the same scheme. 3 small rooms, 2 big rooms, and we found it always important that you would be aware when you go from one room to the other room of the transition, and the middle room contains the stairs. So here you can see it's always the same scheme, very simple. And then in the section you see that all the rooms have their own individual height, and that it's always a development in height which individualizes the room. And we also thought that it would be nice to make the rooms interchangeable. So currently they actually want their atelier downstairs, and they want to live here and sleep here and have a working room also here. But we can also imagine that after a while they will start living here and working here and sleeping here, so that there's a certain exchange or interchangeability. As I said before, it would be possible to have a garden around, and the most private side of the building would be the roof terrace. This is the scheme of the rooms, and this is a drawing of the section. And we had large discussions with the client about the positioning on the plot, because we started with positioning it right along the road here, parallel. And then at a certain point we thought that it would become very static to have a big window looking out over the trees. That would almost act as a static painting. Beautiful one, but very static. And then we said, could we individualize the building by turning it 45 degrees, and then make it possible to have long diagonal views over along the crowns of the trees, which would give more dynamic and more depth. Now, they were not very happy with that idea. And we have been standing there on ladders with pieces of windows to convince them, and in the end they were convinced. And we are very thankful for these daring clients to engage with such things. And this is the building as it is, not there anymore. The building is still there, but this was the first building in the row, and now it has a lot of neighbors which are very close. As you can see here, the fence is still there. But of course the beautiful trees are still there. And I was talking about the neighbors which really come close. They are now like here. And the good thing is now that they also have a nice garden around, but it doesn't provide a lot of privacy. So for real privacy you go all the way up, and there you have a large roof terrace, and then you can walk naked, because you will always be covered by the line of the balcony, and that's actually the most private part between the crowns of the trees. Now the brickwork is something we paid quite some attention to, because it is a brick that we intended to use for inside and outside, preferably also one brick which would be insulated. We did not manage, so we went to a classical inner load-bearing inner structure made out of bricks, and an outer shell out of bricks, but they're in the same system and measurements. When we talk about painting facades, of course we are aware of the people that have been thinking about the use of color and paint and decoration as well. And we find it hard to make this into a manifest or a very sharp statement. But we do see it as something which is very useful and beautiful because of its directness. So by only adding one layer, you can change the whole appearance of a building. As you can see here in this beautiful example of Venturi, this layer of paint completely changes the silhouette of the building in a way, and it starts playing with the windows, ignoring them, and starts to individualize. Yet simultaneously it's like a sticker against the building, which is also obeying to the form of the building, of course. That's a beautiful ambiguity. Next to that, in the Netherlands there is also a tradition of decorating brick buildings. So, and that tradition in the Neo-Renaissance was to not embellish it with expensive marble or bluestone. No, just with cheap plaster or white paint, and to make all kinds of patterns referring to building elements like keystones, but they're actually more a painting than that they really have this function. And they have a function. I would call that function scale, beauty, and that is a difficult function, of course, but it's something that we try to learn from. So we started to use keystones as well here. And these windows, they have a lintel, these ones as well, so the keystones start to separate, and sometimes they get lost and form their own story. Now this brick here is a double high brick. It's almost square, and we paid quite some attention to the joints between the bricks. They bulb out, and they give this notion of textile to the top, and they bulb out here to give more tactility to the building. And when you start using such a layer, a white layer, then here in the depth of the window you stop, and then the present is that you get almost a decorative pattern here because of the joints, as you can see here. And yeah, the nice thing about this is that it brings also the plinth and the top closer together, although there's a very strict separation. People passing by are wondering whether they are going to paint, when the inhabitants are going to paint this, and are also asking the clients whether their house is actually finished. But they got used to it by now. And this is the interior. It's a complete brick interior. We thought at first that it would be cheap, but then we found out that we, of course, had to draw everything, all the electricity, all the lintels, and we fully engaged with it and enjoyed it. But it actually requires, of course, much more attention because when you would plaster everything, you could be very sloppy with your bricks, and now everything would be visible and therefore needed to be perfectly clean. The clients promised us not to paint the brick in the interior, but to first see if they would get used to this brick environment of their interior. And here you can see that there's quite a distinction between a space like this. This is the living room. It's 4 meters high, and then this is next to it, and that's a more intimate space with a lower ceiling. And because of the windows are positioned on the same height. The relation with the windows is also different because you will completely be covered on this side, while on the other side you will be more revealed. By pushing the windows also more to the corners of the building, like you can see in some of the Venetian palaces, the corner would also open up and would form something which you could understand as a bay window. I would say that's something you can see here. Now, by now, the clients have painted some of the walls white or grayish, and to be honest, it was not a bad choice because it's a bit the same that what happens to the outside. You just paint some of the surfaces and it doesn't hurt that much. It's actually quite comfortable, and they did not paint everything white, just some of the surfaces are white. And it, I would say it stresses the individuality of the rooms also, because you really get different environments now. Now, I'm going to stop, but not before I've told you that we're not only doing small projects, we're also engaged into bigger projects, urban projects. We really like to be engaged in thinking about how a building should perform in a city environment. This is a competition we lost for a housing complex on the market in Groningen. This is a competition we lost. That's 600 units for a new part of the town of Utrecht. We did this in a team where we make urban blocks, housing, and this was a competition we lost in Berlin on the Lützow-Ufer. We had quite tough competition, and 3 housing blocks, about 60 units. And this is a competition we won, and it's a visitor center for the National Park, the Hoge Veluwe, one of the biggest national parks in the Netherlands. It's not a very big building, it's about 3,000 square meters, but it has a lot of attention because it's the main building in the park. And this is a sneak preview because this is the model, and it's currently under construction. Yesterday I was there, and the fundaments of the building are being poured out of concrete. So it will be opened in June next year, and so there's not more to tell about it right now. That will be for a next lecture. Thank you. I would appreciate it if you have questions. And if it's too warm, I would completely understand. But feel free to ask anything.
Mm-hmm. The grid outside,
Mm-hmm.
is the first layer
Mm-hmm.
on the facade.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide it? Is it in connection with the ground floor and the
Yeah.
building behind, or is it in connection with
Yeah, that's a nice question because it's completely artificial. It's not related to the floors. No, and it's actually, for Dutch standards, it's very unusual to use in situ poured concrete. So the walls are of load-bearing concrete, the inner shell. While we have a prefab culture in the Netherlands. In the New Bergen project, it was not possible to do it in prefab because you would also need a steel structure, and that would in the end cause diagonals in front of the window. And then because the architect was so much against diagonals in front of the window, the contractor in the end decided to use in situ poured concrete, and that means a complete flat shell, which is load bearing. So everything that is put in front of that as a raincoat is decorative, you could say. So the beams of the grid you see have no other function than to give scale to the building, and of course it slightly represents the floor, but I think there's even I would say 85 centimeters difference between the beam and the interior floor. How did we decide on the dimensions of that grid? By testing a lot of things, because we noticed if we would divide it into 3 or divide it into only a grid in one that would go up all the way to the roof line, that it would become too monumental. If you would divide it in smaller or bigger fields, then the idea of scale would completely change. It would become bigger. And now we found, I would say, a balance which is about making it a sort of urban object. And that has to do with the verticality of the grid. And that, and oh, yeah.
Never in connection with the neighborhood.
Not well. Of course, it gives a size. It gives a. That's a bit what I meant. If you would go with the grid all the way up to the roof line, it would be too monumental and would then not. I would make itself too important in a way. So, indeed, it's a way of. It's a way of structuring everything, binding everything together by using this grid, and then giving size or proportions to it, and then you can tune it indeed to the scale of the environment. Yes, yeah, that played a role, of course. Yeah. But that was, I would say, that was quite hard working to find that the right proportions for that grid. Yeah. Because of course we started with the grid as something representing the inside of the building. And then we found out that we had to shift the floors because we couldn't manage to make an in-between floor that would contain the toilets. And by shifting these floors, we also, as a result, needed to shift the grid. And then we thought, hey, but now the grid gets a really strange proportion. We don't want that. So we disconnect these things now. Which from a logical point of view or from the point of view of constructional logic, or even this horrible word honesty, is something you would actually like to avoid. But the inside is not something that needs to perform on the outside one-on-one. It's also something that you can disconnect. It's also something that you can make a face which has an urban performance, so to say, on the outside of the building, while the inside tells something else. Now, to a certain amount, I would say, but in that sense, form follows function is something we do not really understand. Yeah. I give long answers. Yes. Yes.
You ended up your lecture with this comment that you're not only doing small size projects, but you started your lecture with this massive building, Monadnock in Chicago, where you also found the name of your office.
Mm-hmm.
So And sometimes I don't know if you share this opinion, but some architectural offices have problems in scaling their quality from the smaller projects to bigger projects when they're becoming bigger and so on. So
More successful, yeah.
More successful, yes, let's say more successful.
Yeah.
And I think you have an incredibly high quality in designing also details and so on. And you showed us a lot of references, and you didn't show us another part of your references, like perhaps Adolf Loos or whatever. But do you think you can keep this kind of quality in detail and program and concept while becoming bigger and more successful?
That's a good question. Well, I see, of course, the challenge. And we're not at the point that we're so successful that we only make these big buildings. They're all lost competitions. But of course, we're also working on, simultaneously working on bigger schemes. But Sander and me, we were both trained in an environment where we learned to think about bigger scale projects. And it was more or less by accident that we got that we were not clever and entrepreneurial enough to immediately have these bigger scale buildings and commissions within our office. So I don't know if it's lucky. I mean, simultaneously these small projects, they require as much as concentration and dedication as a bigger project, but I would say that by thinking of, being trained on thinking of larger structures, we feel quite comfortable with scaling up and thinking of larger buildings. But we do realize that the refinement of the things we make when it is about small-scale objects, that you have to use different strategies actually. And so the refinement of a joint is something, of course, we talk about with the contractor, but we also try to be a bit, it's a horrible word, it's agile to actually anticipate to the reality of a bigger industrialized building, prefabricated. And we're currently working on an apartment complex of nearly 50 units, and we noticed that you can actually have 2 or 3 topics or motives that you can involve, but not on every level. So there are certain parts that you have to accept that they are more standard, which in these small projects is then you're more able to control it all. And that has all to do with, I would say, the Dutch building industry, that you're not completely invited inside, for example, to also be in control of the inside of a building, to the level that we are engaged in it when we do these small projects. So I would say, yes, we can, but in a different way.
I also have a question. When you were presenting your work, I think it was interesting that you also mentioned the qualities that the drawings have for you and visual representations, because I see parallels to also the work of Miroslav Schick. Interestingly enough, I think when you look at Schick's drawings, they talk about maybe empathy and also sadness, I would say, almost in a Hopper-like way. When I look at your representations, they have tendencies to tend towards nostalgia sometimes. I know that you don't like it, but I think there is a world depicted that is maybe not part of the Dutch contemporary world, but a world that points to some other time. When you're making up these visualizations, visualizations, what is the world you are, let's say, envisioning?
Now that is a nice question. Well, the thing that strikes us about the works of Miroslav Schick is, of course, that is indeed this embracing of the drawing as a very important tool to talk about atmosphere and Stimmung, tuning. But indeed, way too nostalgic for us. So we try to step away from that to find, I would say, perhaps a more contemporary tone of voice, but that's a very tricky thing to say. But I think in general we have more increasingly tried to make our buildings a bit less heavy and to make them more light and playful, and to study painters and the work of painters like Hopper, but also others. Peter Doig, for example, helps a lot to not only think about depicting something, but also to even, I'm not completely sure whether we manage, but to also think of things as spontaneity and I cannot answer your question in a direct way by saying this is the point on the horizon where we would like to picture ourselves as the ideal environment. But I think there are several influences, also the Kiriko, which helps us to perhaps to emphasize also the beauty of the object that we try to make. And sometimes we use illusion to put this emphasis on the object quality of the building. Yet simultaneously, we also, but now I go a bit away from the topic, we also have discussions with our fellow architects that say, yeah, you are only making objects, and they're actually not engaging with the context. But that's not true, because that was a bit in the answer to your question. We study the implementation of these objects very carefully by positioning them, by scaling them in the right way, and in that sense we completely tune them to their environment as well, but not to such a point that the object quality gets lost.
When you look at the work, the way I interpret it is from a set of, let's say, introduced elements, the question is how do you rearrange them in a way that they open up for modernity, or for modernity, for progressive type of view on the world.
Yeah, that's also the way, that's very in a beautiful, compact way, formulated how we think about it. Indeed, yeah. Warm enough? Okay. Thank you.